In this video, we'll analyze 6 games exhibiting Mikhail Tal's tactical wizardry in the Benoni Defense, an opening where every move bristles with audacious creativity and daring sacrifices. The first opponent is Anatoly Ufimtsev, a strong chess master. He starts d4 and Mikhail Tal replies knight f6. After c4, black unveils the Benoni Defense with c5. In the Benoni Defense, black threatens to exchange the c-pawn for white's valuable central d-pawn. He also immediately gains space on the queen side, hinting at a potential expansion on that side of the board. White's most popular response, d5, is played, avoiding the exchange and gaining space. Tal challenges white's advanced pawn with e6, and white supports it with knight c3. Black captures it, and white recaptures with the c-pawn, maintaining his space advantage while keeping 2 central pawns to black's 1. Black's idea so far is to create a pawn majority on the queen side to eventually create a passed pawn. He understands that white will have an advantage in the center, but his goal is to create a sharp and dynamic position in which he can counterattack. Black plays d6, stopping white from gaining any more space, and white carries on developing with knight f3. Tal follows g6, realizing that his dark squared bishop can be incredibly useful on the long diagonal to control the center and support a queenside pawn push in the long run. White pushes e5, opening his bishop and supporting his d-pawn. Black fianchettos the bishop on g7, white develops his bishop to e2, and both sides castle. Black's rook e8 adds an attacker to the e-pawn, threatening to capture it. So white drops his knight back to e2 to defend, while clearing the way to push the f-pawn. Now black's main way to progress in this position is to push the b-pawn, leading his charge on that flank. But white knows this and is keeping that square under heavy surveillance, with plans to clamp down even further if necessary. In light of this, Tal plays knight a6, initiating a clever maneuver to battle for the b5 square. On the other end, white plays it safe, shifting the king to h1 so that the f-pawn can leave home without worrying about the king's security. Black moves his knight to c7, where it pressures white's center and also supports the b-pawn push. White puts a stop to b5 with a4, so black reinforces it with rook b8. Then white launches an attack on the king side with f4. Now black plays a6, making his final preparations for b5, only to have his plans completely foiled with white's a5. Now b5 would be met with en passant, and although black gets an open b file, white would have the open a file and an initiative. Tal, with great composure, plays bishop d7, planning to put a piece on b5 instead. Now white wants to play e5 to open the center, but this would leave the d-pawn hanging. So he plays bishop f3 to support the d-pawn when the e-pawn is pushed. Black jumps his knight into an active post on b5 before white strikes with e5. This gives black the chance to win a pawn by capturing on e5, and after white recaptures, taking the pawn with the rook. However, white's compensation lies in the form of piece activity, starting with knight c4 attacking the rook. Tal, in aggressive fashion, keeps the rook in the thick of things, moving it to f5. White attacks it again with knight e3, and black shifts it to f4. Black's rook is not retreating, and it's starting to run out of squares, so white plays knight e2, trying to drive the rook into a corner. Black just lets this happen, moving the rook to h4, enticing white to attack it again with g3. Now black does have some safe squares available, but he surprises everyone by moving the rook to e4, where it is en prise, which means it can be taken. Now if white leaves the rook alone, black would carry on with moves like queen e7 and bishop g4, trying to remove defenders from around white's king. This would all lead to a promising attack for black. Instead, white takes the offered material, capturing the rook, and black recaptures with the knight. Tal's rationale is that after white played g3, there are serious light squared weaknesses around white's king, and so it was worth exchanging the rook for the light squared bishop. White continues knight f4, putting the knight on an active square, and black follows suit, placing his knight on d4, where it covers the f3 square. Now the threat is bishop b5 attacking the rook, and the rook is responsible to defend against knight f2, which would be a royal fork, but it has no safe square on the f file to do that. In light of this, white plays king g2, getting out of the royal fork. Tal carries on with queen e7, paving the way for his rook to enter the game. White plays rook e1, lining up the rook with black's queen. Then black plays h5, gaining important space on the king side. White lifts his rook to a3 to defend laterally, and black plays rook e8, activating his rook on the open e file. This is the moment that white slips up. He could play a move like knight c4, and although black would still have good attacking chances, things would be more in the balance. Instead, white plays knight e2, trying to eliminate black's dominant knight. Now black has an outstanding move to capitalize on white's mistake. Can you find it? White's last move gave up control of the h3 square, and Tal exploits this by playing the move bishop h3 check. If the king goes to h1, then knight f2 would win the queen by way of a royal fork. And if the king goes to g1, then knight f3 check would force the king to h1, after which knight f2 would actually be checkmate. So white captures the bishop so that he at least gets an extra piece even though it walks into a royal fork. But Tal wants more than just the queen. He plays knight g5 and black resigns. Checkmate is unstoppable. If king h4, then knight d to f3 would be checkmate. And if king g2, then black would play queen e4 check. The king moving to one of these two squares would run into knight h3 check, which would force the king to f1, after which queen f3 would be checkmate. And the king going to f1 would walk into queen f3, which would force the king to g1, after which knight h3 would be checkmate. Tal sacrificed a rook to put white in a tricky situation, and it paid off with a wonderful checkmating combination. The next opponent is Samuel Reshevsky, one of the world's leading grandmasters at the time, and he meets the Benoni defense with d5 gaining space. Tal's e6 promptly challenges the pawn, and white plays knight c3 to support it. Black captures the pawn and white recaptures. Then d6 blockades the pawn while opening up the light-squared bishop. White continues e4, establishing a pawn presence in the center, and black plays g6, paving the way for a bishop fianchetto. White's bishop b5 develops with check, but black also develops the knight to d7 in blocking the check. Then f4 signals white's intent for play on the king side. Tal puts his bishop on the long diagonal, aiming dangerously down the queen side, before white develops his knight to f3, and both sides castle. a6 hits the bishop, so it retreats to d3, and black could continue expanding with b5, but he opts for rook e8, putting considerable pressure on white's e4 pawn. However, this gives white the chance to stop black's expansion on the queen side with a4, and he takes it. Then black pushes c4, hitting the bishop and making way for the knight to jump to c5. The bishop retreats to c2, where it can still defend the pawn, and black jumps the knight to c5, adding a third attacker to e4. This impels white to push the pawn to e5. Tal follows with a tricky move, knight g4, attacking the e5 pawn several times. Now if white takes the pawn on d6, then black would play knight d3 with the threat of queen b6 check, followed by knight d to f2, which would win a whole bunch of material. So white must capture the knight with the bishop. Then black would first play queen b6 check, forcing the king to h1 before recapturing on d3. Then white would have a hard time stopping knight f2 check, which would hurt. For example, queen d2 would be met with the bishop taking the knight to remove the defender of the e2 square, followed by rook e2, which would be pretty brutal. And a5 might be a bit more challenging to meet, but black could play knight f2 and still get a good position. Back to the game. White finds the best move, h3, forcing the knight to its only available square on h6. Then white's bishop e3 attacks the knight, threatening to capture it and severely damage black's pawn structure while creating a well-advanced pawn for himself. So black retreats the knight to d7, adding another attacker to the e5 pawn. Now there is a pin on the pawn to the bishop, so white cannot capture the d6 pawn. White's best move is queen d2, so that if black captures the pawn, the recapture would open up an attack on the knight. Instead, white chooses an ultra-aggressive move, g4, assembling an avalanche of pawns to sweep over black's kingside. However, this just leaves the e-pawn up for grabs, and Tal swoops it off the board, capturing with his pawn. After white's recapture, black takes the pawn with his knight, leading to an exchange of knights, and black's rook on e5, where it attacks the white bishop. The bishop slides over to d4, counterattacking, with an x-ray on the bishop behind it, and black swings the rook over to g5, peering at the enemy king. Then white captures the bishop on g7. Tal, in wanting to take his opponent into a deep dark forest where 2 + 2 = 5 and the path leading out is only wide enough for one, does not recapture the bishop, capturing the pawn on g4 instead. Now the discovered check threats are way too serious. So white captures the knight, and black recaptures with the bishop, attacking the queen. White finds the best move, queen d4, defending the bishop and holding on to his 2-piece advantage in exchange for 3 pawns. It's up to Tal now to lure white into a labyrinth where one wrong turn leads to trouble. He starts bishop h3, opening a discovered check. The king goes to f2, and black plays rook g2, skewering the king and the bishop. Now white should move his king to safety on e1, but he goes to f3, setting a trap for black. If black were to take the bishop, then white would seize the initiative, throwing moves like bishop h6, threatening checkmate, and knight e4 with vicious ideas. Tal does not take the bait, instead taking the initiative all for himself. He plays queen g5, threatening a checkmate in 3 of queen g3 check, and after the king moves to its only square, e4, f5 would be played, followed by bishop takes f5 checkmate. White moves the queen over to f4, defending and begging for a queen exchange. Black declines, shifting the queen to h5 with check. The king slides over to e3 before black swings his rook to e8 with another check. Now white's best chance is blocking with the bishop, even though it would give up a piece after f5. Instead, white plays king d4, giving black one move to take the lead in this game. Can you find the winning move? The move Tal plays is rook g4, pinning the queen to the king. At this point, it's all over. White saves his bishop while he still can before black captures the rook, winning the exchange. White recaptures, then black captures the queen with check, and white recaptures with the rook. Queen h2 hits the rook, so it moves to e4 where it sees the black rook. Queen f2 check by black forks the king and the bishop, and white dodges check. Black calmly moves his rook over with check, getting out of the attack, and after the king moves, he captures the bishop, gaining a decisive material advantage that convinces white to resign. Tal plunged the game into total pandemonium, just how he likes it, emerging as the sole survivor. The third opponent is Bukhuti Gurgenidze, a Georgian grandmaster, and he also meets the Benoni defense with d5. Tal's e6 challenges the advanced pawn, and after white plays knight c3, black exchanges pawns in the center, giving white an advanced central pawn, which he blockades with d6. White follows knight f3 developing before black plays g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. e4 gaining central space is followed by bishop g7. White plays bishop e7 and both sides castle. Tal swiftly shifts his rook to the e-file, threatening the e4 pawn. So white brings the knight to d2 where it defends, and can also later go to an active post on c4. Black's knight a6 starts a maneuver to c7, aiming to support a queenside expansion, and white replies rook e1, indirectly defending the e4 pawn. After black plays knight c7, white puts an immediate stop to b5 ideas with a4. Now if black plays a6 to support b5, white may play a5, putting a complete halt to black's plans by way of an en passant capture. So black plays b6 to stop the effectiveness of white's a5. Then white plays queen c2, further supporting the center. With the queen moved, the g4 square is defended one less time, so black jumps his knight to g4, probing on the king side. White should probably just take the knight, but he plays h3 to kick it out. Then black boldly captures the pawn on f2. Now black's threat is to capture on h3, ripping open the king side, after which queen h4 hitting the rook would be strong, with plans of recruiting the rest of the army for a devastating attack. White could stop all these ideas with knight f3, but black would just capture the knight on c3, removing the defender of e4, and then win a second pawn. Instead, white captures the knight with the king. Tal's queen swoops into h4 with check. The king goes to f1, and bishop d4 threatens checkmate. So white miserably retreats the knight to d1 to defend. Then black plays a move so remarkable that I did a spit take when I saw it for the first time. Queen takes h3. Now white cannot recapture because bishop takes h3 would be a spectacular checkmate. There is also the threat of queen h1 checkmate. So white plays bishop f3, creating an escape square for the king. And with the bishop now moved, the queen can actually be recaptured now. So she goes to h2, staying within touching distance of the enemy king. Black has a new threat, capturing on d5 since the e-pawn is pinned to the king's only escape square, and queen h1 would be checkmate if the pawn were captured. So white reactivates his knight on e3 where it defends the pawn. With white's king being pushed towards the center, Tal tries to break things open with f4. White jumps the knight over to c4, trying to keep his position solid, and black captures on e4 before white recaptures with the bishop. Then black's bishop a6 produces a potent pin, pushing white into a precarious position. Now black may have some tactics of capturing the bishop, and after the queen recaptures, moving the other rook to e8. To avoid anything, white just drops his bishop back to f3. Black lifts his rook to e5, preparing to double rooks on the e-file, and white lifts his rook to a3, defending the knight laterally. Black swings the other rook over to the e-file, and white plays bishop d2. At this moment, white hovers on the precipice of defeat, and Tal pushes him over the edge with knight takes d5. The knight on d5 attacks the knight on e3 for a fourth time. But it also prepares to go to f4, cutting off key squares from the white king, while preparing for rook g5 to land a final winning combination. So white must get rid of the knight, capturing it with the bishop with check. Black recaptures with the rook, and white cannot recapture because queen g1 would be checkmate. Now white's king is in all sorts of trouble, so he tries to flee with king e2. Tal finds the simplest win, capturing the knight on e3 to remove the defender of the other knight on c4. White recaptures with the rook, and black grabs the knight on c4 with check. White resigns, realizing he cannot recapture with the queen because it would leave the defense of the bishop, leading to a simple checkmate in 2 with queen takes g2, followed by queen takes d2. In terms of material, white is already down 3 pawns, and with the king in terrible shape, Tal would surely win a whole lot more. The fourth opponent is Imari Niamela. He responds to the Benoni defense by gaining space with d5 and meeting black's challenge of the pawn with e6 by supporting it with knight c3. Tal captures the pawn, white recaptures with the c-pawn, and black blockades it with d6 before white expands in the center with e4. Black's g6 aims to fianchetto the bishop on a strong diagonal before white immediately presses forward with f4. Black moves the bishop to g7, white develops the knight to f3, and black castles before white plays bishop e7, preparing to castle himself. Tal's rook e8 adds a second attacker to the e4 pawn, and in response, white decides to push the pawn where it hits black's knight. Black captures with the pawn, and white recaptures before black's knight jumps to g4, opening up several attacks on the e4 pawn. White has no way to defend, so he pushes the pawn again, trying to open up black's kingside. Black captures the pawn, and white just castles. Black captures a second pawn, and white recaptures with the knight. Now white sacrificed the pawn to create a completely open position, in which he hopes that his lead in development will give him the advantage. Yet it's usually Tal who strives in these sharp positions. He plays bishop e6, developing with tempo, and white replies bishop c4, defending the knight. Black carries on with knight e5, attacking the bishop and offering an exchange of knights. White plays bishop g5 with a more serious threat on the queen. And black shouldn't just move the queen because white would capture the knight, and after the bishop recaptures, he would play rook e1 with a dominant position. Black finds a clever tactic, capturing the knight on f3 with check to remove the defender of the bishop. White recaptures with the queen, and black captures the bishop on g5. Then white plays rook e1, activating the rook on the open file. Tal shifts his rook over to f8, attacking the queen, and white replies with a very tricky move. Rook takes e6. The idea is that if black takes the queen, then it surrenders control of the back rank, and white would play rook e8 check, which also gets off the white bishop's diagonal. Black moving the king to f7 would run into knight c7 with a discovered check. So black's best bet would be to block the check. Then knight f4 would open a discovered check, which would force the king to g7 before white would capture the rook. Now the threat of knight e6 with a royal fork would force the queen to move. White would still play knight e6 check, which would force the king to h6 before he would capture the bishop too. Now in this variation, black is technically up material, but his knight and rook are not in the game, nor will they be anytime soon. So it's black's queen facing 16 points of white material. Now the variation could go on for a few more moves, but white's eventual threat of rook h4 with checkmate would force black to give up the queen for the rook. Back to the game. Tal finds the best move, bishop d4 check, giving his king the vital g7 square to escape any back rank checks. After white moves the king, black confidently captures the queen on f3 and meets white's rook e8 check with the simple king g7. White doesn't have the discovered checks anymore in this case. He captures the rook on f3, suffering a loss of a rook for a queen. In return, he at least has an irritating pin that hinders black's development. Black plays queen c1, checking the king, and white blocks with the bishop. Then Tal cleverly develops his knight to c6, giving away the rook in the corner for free before jumping the knight directly into the action on e5 where it hits white's rook. White menacingly doubles rooks on the 8th rank, but black has no fear. His knight continues its journey with knight g4 threatening a brutal check on the white king, which would force it into discoveries. White doesn't even have a way to stop knight f2 because h3 planning to move the king to h2 would just hang the bishop because the knight interferes with the rook's defense. White just tries rook f3. Tal's knight hops to f2 with check, the king goes to g1, then the knight completes its journey along with the game after it moves to e4, opening a discovered check on the king. White resigns since moving the king to h1 would walk into a beautiful checkmate starting with knight g3 check. The rook capturing would lead to queen f1 checkmate, and the pawn capturing would open the h-file leading to queen h6 checkmate. Hopefully white learned his lesson in this game, which was not to create a sharp and dynamic position against Tal, the greatest to ever play them. The penultimate opponent is Boris Raitov, an Estonian chess champion, and he plays a delayed queen's gambit before ultimately meeting Tal's Benoni defense by gaining space with d5. Black captures the pawn and white recaptures. Then black makes way for his bishop's development with g6, and we note that white could play e6, cramping black's position, but that pawn would likely become more of a weakness since it's so difficult to protect it. Instead, white develops with knight c3. Black puts his bishop on the long diagonal, and white grabs the center with e4. Black castles, white plays bishop e2 preparing to castle 2, and after black's d6 opening up the queenside pieces, white castles. Tal's rook e8 adds an attacker to the e4 pawn, so white drops his knight back to d2 defending. Then black develops his knight to d7 before white thrusts forward with f4. Black plays the tricky move c4, opening up the c5 square for his knight. Now white could capture the pawn, but the e4 pawn would become very difficult to defend, and black's knight c5 would take full advantage of that. So white takes the safer approach, moving his king to h1 off of any checks on the diagonal. Tal jumps his knight to c5, threatening the e4 pawn, so white pushes it forward, attacking the knight. Black is able to win a pawn temporarily by capturing 2 times on e5, but white gets the c4 pawn with an attack on the rook. Black moves the rook to f5, wanting white to capture because then he could recapture while developing his bishop. But white is not so nice, moving his bishop to f3, defending the pawn and interfering with the rook's sight. Black follows with knight g4. White could capture the knight, but black would just capture the rook, which would deflect the queen away from the bishop's defense, and black would just win it back on the next move. Now black's threat with knight g4 is capturing the pawn on h2, and after the king would recapture, queen h4 would fork the king and the knight on c4. So black plays knight e3, challenging the knight and getting out of any fork threats. Black captures the knight, and white develops his bishop to e3 by recapturing with an attack on black's knight. Black defends the attack with b6 before white develops the queen to c7. Tal develops his final minor piece with bishop to a6 with tempo, attacking the white rook, who moves to d1 where it can support the d-pawn. Black continues with bishop e5, pressuring the h2 point. White attempts to trade bishops, and black does not react, playing queen h4 with a checkmate threat. White takes the bishop, allowing black to seize the open e-file by recapturing. White would like to challenge the e-file, but black's queen is guarding that square. So white plays g3, attacking the queen. The queen moves to f3, attacking the white bishop, and white tucks the bishop away on g2. Tal plays rook e8, taking full control of the invaluable e-file. White must fight for it, so he plays queen d1 to be able to support the rook in moving to e1. But black replies rook f5, realizing that the f-file may be more crucial for an attack on the white king. White shifts the rook to the e-file, leading to an exchange of rooks and the control of the e-file switching hands. Black follows with knight e3, hitting the rook and approaching the enemy king. White plays rook e8 check, and black lifts his king out of the attack. With the white rook leaving the back rank, black has the threat of rook f1 check, which would force the bishop to recapture, after which queen f1 would be checkmate. So white plays king g1 guarding the f1 square. Tal cleverly captures the pawn on b2, opening up the bishop to control the f1 square. This means that white shouldn't capture the knight because rook f1 followed by queen f1 would be checkmate. To stop this, white plays h3 to create an escape square for the king. Then black retreats his knight, attacking the queen, and he is satisfied that he has just won a pawn for free. White moves the queen out of the attack to e1. Now things are still manageable for white, but they will slowly go from bad to worse as Tal gradually propels white into a tricky, complicated situation. Queen d4 check is the beginning, and the king goes to h2. Then knight e5 threatens knight f3 check, which would force white to give up one of the king's key defenders, the bishop. So white counterattacks with knight e2, and after black's queen b2, white defends the f3 square with knight g1. Tal's knockout blow is bishop f1, and white resigns. The pinned bishop is attacked twice with the threat of checkmate if the queen were to take it, and there's absolutely no way to defend it. Queen e4 would be met with knight f3 interfering with the queen's defense. White's best bet would be just to capture the bishop on f1, losing a substantial amount of material. Tal's talent in complicated positions still proves to be unparalleled. The final opponent is Vladimir Doroshkievich, a strong chess master, and this game takes a slightly different route to enter the Benoni defense, but as more moves are played, the position should become more and more familiar. After black captures the pawn on e5 and white recaptures, the game enters a standard Benoni defense position. In this case, white has already played f4, choosing an aggressive response to black's opening. Black develops the bishop to g4 and white castles. Now black is at a space disadvantage, meaning he has less room to move around his pieces. Black's light-squared bishop in particular often struggles to get active in the Benoni defense, so black exchanges it off for the knight and white recaptures with the bishop. Tal carries on with this development, bringing his knight out to d2. White prudently tucks his king away on h1, getting out of any attacks on the diagonal, before black plays a6, preparing b5. White develops his bishop, and although Tal could play b5, he opts for rook e8, activating his rook instead. White presses on with g4, and g5 would exploit the shortage of squares that the black knight has. It would be forced to h5, where white would be able to severely damage black's kingside pawn structure by capturing with the bishop. So black plays h6, hindering g5 and giving the knight an escape. Black goes for g5 anyway. Tal captures the pawn, and white does not recapture, playing e5 with an attack on the knight. Now black could capture the pawn, but white would not take back, capturing the g-pawn instead with an attack on the knight, and after it would move, he would play knight e4, getting a very active position in compensation for the pawn sacrifice. Instead, black captures the pawn on f4, counterattacking white's bishop. White takes the knight, opening the e-file, which allows black to capture the bishop with his rook. Then white captures the second piece on g7. In this case, it is Tal who sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns, but he is about to get an incredibly active position and a promising initiative. He plays knight e5, attacking the white bishop so it drops back to g2. Then queen g5 approaches the white kingside. White's knight e4 attacks the queen, so it sidesteps to h4. White follows with queen d2 in an attempt to move to f2 to exchange queens. Black captures the pawn on g7 with his king, creating the threat of rook h8, which would be devastating. So white plays queen f2, offering the exchange of queens, which black accepts before white recaptures with the rook. Then Tal plays f3, cutting off the bishop's defense of the knight. White captures the pawn on d6, and black, wanting to be as accurate as possible, first swings the rook over to d8, attacking the knight. The knight captures on b7 before black captures the bishop with check, and the king recaptures. Black captures the pawn on d5, and after all this, black emerges up a pawn in an endgame with far more active pieces. Black will play knight d3, attacking the rook and the pawn, so white plays b3, getting out of the attack. Tal plays knight d3 anyways, attacking the rook, who slides over to c2, pressuring black's c-pawn. Then black plays the clever rook e1, and white resigns. White's rook is hanging, and if he were to capture the black rook, then the knight recapturing would involve a fork on the king and rook. Black's material advantage would be decisive, and White realizes that he is no match for the trickery of Tal. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.